knowledge can inform conservation hypotheses and ecological hypotheses beyond knowledge. So I study mountain plants and how they respond to climate change. And one way that plants respond to climate change is by changing their seasonal timing, so advancing their phenology. So this is an effect that's been seen across the world. In warmer years with climate change, we see earlier and earlier springs. That's a simplification, but it's a real general trend that we've seen. And in the Tibetan Plateau, which is here, despite this increased warming that you can see from the darker red color on this map, the effect is unclear what the effect on plant phenology that this warming is having is not entirely clear. So some studies have shown advancing phenology, so earlier springs. Others have shown delayed phenology. Others show no trend at all. So I work here at the eastern end of the Himalayas. It's an area with some of the highest temperate plant biodiversity in the world. I work on rhododendrons, which are an especially diverse plant group here, and they flower across different elevations and across different parts of the season. So I thought this would be an especially good bioindicator because they're spread across different parts of the season of how phenology can respond to climate change. Another reason rhododendrons are a great model species for looking at changes in phenology in response to climate change are the historical collections. So this is a pretty remote area by some metrics, but it's also a hotspot of historical collections. Plant hunters like these guys collected tens of thousands of specimens in the area and brought a lot of rhododendrons into horticulture and into herbaria, where they're preserved as dried plant specimens. I'll point out Joseph Rock here on the bottom left, who I'll mention again, who sort of transitioned from being a botanist in the area to an anthropologist. And that gets into another thing, that most of these botanists to a greater or lesser degree relied on indigenous plant collectors, or maybe early parabotanists before Gary Navin used the word. And these people not only cared about rhododendrons as a livelihood in their function as assistants to the Western botanists, but they also came from indigenous groups in the area that were intimately connected with mountain ecosystems, and for whom rhododendrons were a real salient part of the mountain environment. So in order to answer this question of how plant phenology was responding to climate change in the Himalaya then, I employed ecological and evolutionary methods such as monitoring phenology across the elevational gradient. But I also wanted to get back into these historical collections, the plant specimens made by these plant hunters, and get a longer term perspective on this. And then finally, and what I'm going to emphasize today, is that I wanted to also get a historical context from the perspectives of local people. Both the decades of knowledge that individuals have just from observing the environment around them, but also the accreted knowledge that is stored in languages and in traditions and culture. So what's been called local phenological knowledge or traditional phenological knowledge or ethnophenology by Gary, the idea was that then this could offer both direct and detailed observations that I could compare with my ecological field work, but also a long-term set of observations that I could compare with my historical baseline. So to just very, very quickly cut a long story short, this ecological field work was based on 2 years of monitoring on a 1400 elevational meter gradient on Mount Yulong, which is rising above Lijiang City here. After 2 years of very time-consuming field work, I was able to quantify how much rhododendrons as a whole, the different species, were responding to this warming. But that's only 2 years of data. So to get this slightly deeper historical context then, I wanted to talk to local people who had been observing rhododendrons not just 2 years, but for their entire lives, and are part of this deeper and longer cultural continuity. So I worked with 2 ethnic groups in the area. The Naxi are uniquely and anciently connected to the Mount Yulong area. So Yulong Mountain, which is shown at the top here in what's called Dongba script, this unique and fairly old ideographic or pictographic script of the Naxi, it's important in Naxi religion, Naxi history, and it's really central both aesthetically and geographically to the Naxi world. That said, Naxi livelihoods are changing rapidly. They're engaging in tourism. These days, people who do live on the land are usually farmers in the lower elevation valley areas. I also worked with the Nuosu Yi people. And they're more recent migrants from the Sichuan highlands. It's an ecologically similar place, but they're really seen, and they see themselves as immigrants to this area. A really common response in my preliminary interviews that I'd get when I talk to Yi people was, well, we don't hold true Yi knowledge. You have to go to Sichuan to learn about that. You have to talk to those people. So that said, Yi people tend to be in these more marginal areas, higher up on the mountain, and interacting with mountain environments more intimately. So this leads to some interesting questions about how knowledge is structured. So more specifically, what the knowledge differences are between ethnic groups and between rural and urban settings. And maybe more broadly, how generative and conservative processes combine to create dynamism in traditional ecological knowledge. How people are able to change their knowledge systems when they come to a new place or encounter a new climatic situation. So to get at these, I did interviews with 80 residents in 8 villages around Mount Yulong, mountain villages that looked something like this, and for comparison in Lijiang City, very close by, but very different in terms of livelihoods. We did interviews mostly in native languages with these wonderful trilingual field assistants here. You can hear a little bit of Yi language here. It's a bit quiet. So we used photographs to ask about rhododendron uses, their names in local languages, and the distribution across season of the different species and across elevation, which we did with sorting tasks, and also the general similarity of species, which we did with pile sort tasks with these pictures. And one of the things that people told me at first, which I was quite worried about, was that rhododendrons were really a useless species. That, you know, this is an area that's famous for having these really important and valuable medicinal plants, and this wasn't one of them. It also wasn't a crop. So I was faced with the question of sort of, are people going to hold a lot of knowledge about what they call the useless plant? And in fact, they did, yes. So despite this initial disclaimer, people, almost every interviewee reported multiple uses for every single species I asked about. These were important as food for people and for animals, as a source of nectar for honey, as wood for burning and carving. And they also had ritual and symbolic uses. So rhododendron racemosum here is decorating a Naxi sacred spring during a festival that's now associated with the Chinese Spring Festival, but was originally the start of the Naxi New Year. It was really much more of an ecological calendar. They were also represented in language and linguistic knowledge. So usually people would had distinct names for about 6 of the 12 species that I was prompting them with. And in both Naxi and Yi languages, I recovered multiple layers of ethnotaxonomy. So people would give me words for genera of rhododendrons, species, and varieties. One example here is, these again are this Naxi writing system. The Naxi differentiated 2 ethnogenera of rhododendrons, Shuo and Mun. So this is contemporary, given by a Naxi scholar. These are historic, actually recorded by Joseph Rock in the 1920s and written down, but specific species of rhododendron, specific place names that included rhododendron, and rituals that included rhododendrons that he recorded almost 100 years ago. So in pile sorts, there was a lot of variance, and I won't go into a lot of detail about this, but certain species were grouped more often with others, which in this ordination are species that are closer together in the ordination space. And you can see some similarities between Naxi and Yi. For instance, Rhododendron racemosum and impetitum are grouped together as sort of a separate cluster from the other species. And when I fit people's perceptions of elevation and rhododendron flowering time as phenology, and ethnotaxonomy onto this. They're all a significant fit for this. So this suggests that the names plants are given, as well as people's perceptions of when they flower and what elevations they flower, are at least associated with and could be influencing how they see them as similar or different to one another. To summarize then, across many different things I measured, so number of ethnonyms people gave, number of ethnotaxonomic tiers, the sort of granularity of information they would give about the elevations or seasonality of when things would flower, or total uses in useful species. Naxi and Yi people I interviewed in rural areas reported a similar quantity of knowledge. It was different in its quality, but fairly similar. Sometimes Yi people would actually report more knowledge, although I'm a little uncomfortable with sort of comparing knowledge richness with sort of in crude ways like this. What was very clear was that there was a big difference between rural communities and urban communities in Lijiang, which you can see are indicated by these Roman letters here, statistically quite different in quantification of knowledge. And this is maybe not very surprising that people who are programmers or tourism providers in an urban area just don't retain this sort of knowledge. So it does seem that, to answer one of these questions, that livelihood and exposure to the mountain ecosystem essentially has as a much bigger impact, that is, than ethnicity here. And one of the reasons I think this is the case is that, and this is a little bit speculative, but I did talk to Stephen Harrell, who's done work on Yi people, or with Yi people in their Sichuan homelands, is that Yi people had a knowledge system that included rhododendrons. They came to this completely different slate of species. No species are shared, but they knew rhododendrons could be used as seasonal indicators. They had uses for different species. And so it was easy to sort of slot the species from this new environment into a knowledge system and value system that was already there. At the same time, Naxi people who might be a little more urbanized here, it's possible that there may be more conservative processes going on here. There is still practice rhododendron tied to, for instance, this Naxi Spring Festival. Even though it's losing its meaning, there are still rhododendrons connected to the Naxi writing system, even as its meaning changes very greatly from something associated more with ritual to something associated with tourism. So to get back to the question about phenology then, so this is the responses from both Naxi and Yi informants in terms of the sequence of phenology. And again, there's a lot of variation, but also some agreement among the different groups, particularly of some species that flowered especially early. And there was a lot of focus on this seasonal progression of rhododendrons, the thing that I had hoped to see. One example of this is Shomaguchi. This is Rhododendron racemosum, that early flowering one, which the Yi people called buckwheat rhododendron. It flowered at the right time to plant buckwheat. And in general, rhododendron species were linked to festivals, to crop plantings, to timings to gather natural forest products. And songs and sayings that people reported about rhododendrons invariably linked to this flowering time and seasonality. However, the majority of people, and this was one of the most consistent responses I got, were saying these phenological indicator values of rhododendrons were becoming messed up. They weren't reliable anymore, things were changing, and now, for instance, this was flowering at the right time to plant potatoes and not to plant buckwheat. So what about why I started this looking for climate-driven change? In fact, people did perceive this short-term effect of weather on phenology. In warmer years, rhododendrons would flower earlier, and this was a nice match for what I had seen in my ecological field work. But they didn't see any directional long-term change. And this was really surprising to me, because this is why I had consulted them as a resource to start with. And I asked myself, okay, maybe these are culturally salient, people are paying attention to them, but they just aren't looking at things in the same way. This is a sort of different epistemology here, and people aren't a good source of long-term information in this context. As it happened, I actually could go back and completely verify what they were reporting with this third long-term perspective I had, which was from the herbarium specimens, these past plant collections. So these confirmed this lack of long-term change here. So over the last 50 years, the time period that people would be observing for, even though there's been warming, there hasn't been a long-term change. And this was also surprising to us. And it was actually looking at these different data sources, the historical collections, and the interviews with local people that caused us to look back at this data a little more closely, do some analyses based on warming in different parts of the season, and see that although rhododendrons were responding year to year to warming by advancing their phenology, by flowering earlier, they actually would flower later after especially warm winters. And this is something that in fact, a lot of overwintering plants do, that they don't respond to spring warming until they receive a certain amount of cold or chilling in the winter time, in the fall, or the first freezes. And so when we actually made a model based on this from the herbarium specimens, but informed by these interviews, it fit what we were seeing in our ecological field work with very high accuracy. And so we're fairly confident in this, even though we came to it in this kind of roundabout way. And it's something that, as we were publishing this, was really coming out of a lot of detailed physiological work and work across many different taxa in very well-studied systems, New England and in the United Kingdom. So we were really pleased that then we could present this example of how local and indigenous observations in combination with other sort of what you might think of as non-traditional data sets from an ecological point of view, although for us they're very traditional data sets, right? Could inform the questions that we ask in ecology and in conservation. And I think it speaks to this sort of still, I guess not untapped uses of these data sources, but the fact that it's not as often joined on to ecological and conservation questions then. So I'm going to skip past this, and because I have a little bit of extra time,
let me just announce again, if anyone's coming for the second talk, Richard's step has been rescheduled for tomorrow at 3:45 in the great room. So we're going to run over a little bit here.
Yeah, so we're going to run over a little and then start Kelly more or less on time. So that gives me time to have this really quick postscript about the portrayal of people in southwest China. So this is Joseph Rock not wearing his fur hat anymore. And in fact, I think he's given his fur hat to this guy. So, you know, there's a long tradition in a lot of indigenous areas. I'm really preaching to the choir here, but visiting botanists and anthropologists portraying local people as, you know, these exotic and dangerous people. And again, you know, Gary just said it much better than I can, but in fact, these people they're vital colleagues, they're hardworking researchers, and this isn't just a modern thing either. So this is a photo that actually came to light fairly recently from archival work in Edinburgh. And for a long time I was frustrated because I was working with specimens collected by George Forrest, and he wasn't recording a lot of detail on when the plants were collected. And so I wasn't able to use it for my herbarium analysis, unfortunately. I didn't understand why he was only recording month of collection and not day of collection on these. And then I realized that thanks to a book published by Eric Mugler, who had done this archival work, that in fact the collections weren't being made by Forrest at all. They were being made by this team of people. This is an herbarium press full of collections. Now Forrest is on this trip because he's taking pictures, but a lot of trips they just went off on their own, and they were doing these collections and were never being acknowledged by name. So Eric's done some interviews and found out that this guy actually is Zhao Changzhang, whose collection number should be on a lot of these specimens, in fact. So, you know, anyway, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but of course this is something, this engagement with local people and recognizing them as co-producers of knowledge that you know, we're trying to do more of. Jan Salick, who is my co-author on this paper that I presented today, and I have a paper on Naxi sacred space with a Naxi co-author that is currently under review. So hopefully we'll be taking a small step in that direction. So I've got a few minutes for questions, actually lots of minutes for questions, if you have any.
About that area is why you get this kind of incredible hyper-speciation of rhododendrons, because it's something in California we associate with annuals, like lupins and buckwheat.
Yeah.
But here you've got, you know, an incredible number of species of a long life perennial in a very narrow area.
Yeah, that's true. You know, I just saw a new paper in Journal of Biogeography by someone who is doing rhododendron diversity in 50 by 50 kilometer grid squares. So it's not that big, right? 50 by 50 kilometers. And he was getting many cells that had more than 100 species inside that grid cell of rhododendrons only. So a lot of this is beta diversity. So Jan's done some work that shows that from mountain to mountain, you get this sort of replacement of, you know, all different species, the same genera across many different genera, not just rhododendrons, but all different species. So sort of like what we're seeing between the Sichuan area where the Yi people came from and here. Another reason is just this incredible topographic heterogeneity. You know, you have the Mekong and Salween and Irrawaddy coming off the Tibetan Plateau and cutting these deep gorges through the world's highest mountains. And it's at this sort of nexus of, you know, in Mount Yulong you can hike from the top, which is yak temperatures, so cold, arid Tibetan areas, down to the mid areas where there are more Naxi villages and it's cow zone. And keep going down into the headwaters of the Yangtze River in a very long day hike and be down in water buffalo zone. So there's a lot of accessible area.
That still doesn't explain it. Is there some specific genetic susceptibility to evolve very quickly in rhododendrons? Because we see a contrast in California between Ceanothus and Adenostoma, and same habitat diversity, same, you know, range from, you know, freezing to death to boiling to death within one day hike. Ceanothus, there's like 80 species. Adenostoma, there's 2. So clearly there's some sort of big difference in how susceptible these guys are to speciation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. There's a lot of hybridization. They're mostly generous pollinated, and so it's hard to know exactly what's going on there.
It's interesting.
Denise, yeah?
Oh, I just wondered if does that have anything to do with timescale? I'm not really being, you know, just curious
Yeah, it might,
in terms of the,
but I'm not
yeah.
an expert on
I
it.
just kind of had a quick comment.
Yeah.
Since I usurped the situation there to connect to Jean's point, but, you know, I found in the early 2000s up in Jetong, you know, just further north in Zhongyan area, similar kind of sentiments about people saying they don't really know that much about their environment.
Yeah.
When they actually really do know a lot about their environment, but it's, so I think it's partly a cultural thing of when the researcher asks them, what do you know? Oh, I don't know, you know. But, yeah, so that's one point, but the other thing is too, and you know, we're gonna talk, right, but these rhodis are really important in Tibetan medicine.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a cultural difference with the Naxi and
Yeah.
Yi and the Tibetans. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I don't think Eve's here, but Eve and her student Liz Georgian published a very nice piece in the same area, some of the same interviews with Yi people actually, that compares different ethnicities that I recommend.
Yeah. To try to address hopefully what Jean was getting at is that in zoology we get this sort of phenomenon we would call them species flocks, because when you get a